When we hear the word Holocaust, our thoughts immediately default to numbers, death camps, fighting, and ultimate freedom. Behind those headlines is a chilling silence, a silence about the everyday travail of women struggling just to be in their own bodies in the midst of horror. Did we ever take the time to ask ourselves, what did survival mean for a woman when even simple bodily functions became unbearable weights? Now, imagine living through unimaginable violence. No soap, no clean water, no piece of cloth to claim for yourself, and still being asked to keep laboring, keep moving, keep living. In our today's video, we shine a light on one of the most overlooked truths of history: the silent suffering and unspoken courage of women in the Holocaust, through the prism of something as ordinary and as forgotten as menstruation. The camps did not merely seek to annihilate identity. They went after all that made a human being human. For women, that dehumanization came in layers. Menstrual cycles, which were already stigmatized prior to the war, turned into an emblem of shame, abandonment, and sheer survival. But what made this ordeal truly catastrophic wasn't merely the lack of sanitary items. It was the total elimination of dignity, privacy, and compassion. Menstruation was not acknowledged, nor was it accommodated. There was no support from camp authorities, no medical recognition, no equipment, no advice. Women were totally on their own, packed into dirty, disease-ridden barracks where lice infested all and infection ran rampant. Even centuries before the camps, menstruation had stigma attached to it. In some ancient societies, periods were regarded as sacred, a manifestation of power or spirituality. In others, they were feared as linked to impurity or isolation. Periods were connected to sin by the Middle Ages in Europe, and by the early 1900s, even as modern sanitary products were just starting to appear, they were still expensive and relatively rare. Disposable pads weren't seen until the 1920s, and tampons weren't sold commercially until the 1930s, both effectively out of reach for the poor or in rural areas. So, when women were sent to concentration camps, many were already ill-prepared, not only for war, but for the total removal of physical autonomy. In the camps, women adapted to survive even that. Some ripped fabric off their provided undergarments and turned it into improvised rags, little patches of cloth they'd stow away like treasures. These were washed and reused whenever water was available, then hidden underneath straw mattresses to dry in private. But that wasn't always possible either. Water was rationed and only made available in protected kitchen spaces. Some women would wait until the wee hours of the morning to rinse their rags quickly, or use pieces of paper, grass, or even leaves to wipe themselves clean. Bleeding through clothing was public shame, another tool to shame. In order to conceal it, numerous covered whatever clothes they had on, but in summer's stifling heat, this was intolerable. No toilets with doors, no painkillers, no comfort. Only a woman and her body, silently suffering as the world around her fell apart. The pain was even more unbearable for little girls, many of whom had not yet menstruated. Taken from their mothers, they underwent this frightening experience alone. No explanation, no comfort, no explanation. In the shadow of that bewilderment, older women intervened. They passed on their knowledge as much as they knew and provided comfort and direction amidst the harsh brutality. These were small acts of resistance, acts of female care, of human solidarity, in a space meant to erase both. And then something even worse started to occur. Within only a few months of living in the camps, many of the women ceased menstruating altogether. Today, doctors verify that severe stress and malnutrition can interfere with a woman's menstrual cycle. When the body is strained to its maximum, it diverts energy away from reproduction. But this does not account for the massive number of women, well over 95%, who ceased menstruating in the concentration camps. Survivors report sickening memories, pills thrust into their hands upon arrival, or unknown substances put into their food. One woman remembered being administered a pink tablet upon arrival at the camp. Others recalled being served soup that had a weak, powdery pink tint, served exclusively to the women. These memories are consistent with evidence that indicates a more concerted effort, a deliberate attempt by Nazi authorities to quash female fertility through covert experiments and chemical interference. Documents found from a 1942 conference at Nazi headquarters produced grim details. Mass sterilization was to be conducted secretly. Scientists were told not to document their chemical sterilization experiments in writing. Historians today suspect hormone-disrupting chemicals might have been added to food or administered through injections, means intended to deprive women of their reproductive capability without their will or consent. No matter the method, the result was catastrophic. Menstruation ceased, and with it, for countless women, so too did any hope of future motherhood. The results were not merely short-term but lasting. Post-war, numerous female survivors experienced severe reproductive complications. Years later, research showed an appalling pattern: enormous levels of infertility, miscarriage, and stillbirth. Of 197 pregnancies in Holocaust survivors, almost one-quarter miscarried and more than 6% resulted in stillbirth. The trauma did not only exist psychologically, it had lasting physical effects. And the psychological cost was incalculable. For many women, the prospect of having a family after surviving genocide was a beacon of hope, something to cling to in the shadows. When that hope was destroyed, it provided another layer of sorrow, this time deeper and quieter. Life in the camps was not just brutally physical, but biologically toxic. These sites were never intended for life, never mind the demands of women's bodies. There were no working sewer systems. Human dung sat to rot beside the barracks. Filth was omnipresent. Neglect hung in the air, and simple hygiene, something many people take for granted, was a luxury no one could afford. Showers were non-existent if they existed. Water was strictly rationed, and when there was water, it was usually dirty or freezing. There was no soap, no clean rag. Frequently, not even a cup or container to retrieve water. Basic sanitation, such as hand washing or rinsing a rag, became all but impossible. Under these conditions, female health declined sharply. The female physiology leaves it particularly susceptible to bacterial infection when it's exposed to dirt. The infection of the urinary tract, yeast infection, and bacterial vaginosis spread like wildfire. They weren't minor inconveniences. They were miserable, untreated sicknesses that got worse with each passing day. Women complained of fevers, searing inflammation, and recurrent infections that made standing or walking painful. But there wasn't any rest, any pause. They were still required to stand in line for roll calls in the freezing temperatures, still commanded to do hard labor with bodies contorted by pain and infection. The pain of women during the Holocaust wasn't necessarily worse than that of men, but it was distinctly different. Both suffered terrorism. But women suffered further in having to survive within a body biologically taxing and emotionally nuanced, without the attention it required. Survival wasn't simply about not dying. It was about living through regimes of pain, shame, and fatigue, with no privacy, no equipment, and no sympathy. There were no sanitary items, no quiet places to escape to, no provision for the physical requirements of being female. The whole environment seemed to try to obliterate the individual, but for women, it also declared war on their very biological identity. And still, even amidst this pain, women created invisible lifelines. They stood guard over each other when others would not, shared rags, whispered comfort, handed down wisdom. These acts of kindness weren't gestures. They were resistance, quiet, powerful, and human. Aged women were mute guardians, leading younger girls through the monstrous facts of their bodies. They shared fabric when they themselves possessed nearly nothing. They whispered words of wisdom. They forsook valuable bites of food. They expressed love at times when even an action of kindness might get a punishment. These small gestures were lifelines, human acts in an establishment designed to shed humanity. But when the time of liberation did come, the agony didn't cease. It just transformed. The world outside the camps demanded survivors to recover, to piece together what was left, and begin anew. But for women, their relationship with their own bodies had been irrevocably altered. Some had never had a normal menstrual cycle and didn't even know what that felt like. Others lost their cycles within the camps and never got them back again. Infertility became a surprise and shattering heartbreak. Women who had held on to the promise of motherhood for years of terror discovered, when the war was over, that the damage, physical as well as emotional, had taken that future away from them. Physicians were frequently unable to say what had occurred. Psychological counseling did not exist, and there were still no words available to capture the intensity of their sorrow, the sorrow of missed time, lost health, lost possibility. Society nudged them forward, to marry, to have children if possible, and to assist in rebuilding a world devastated by war. But no one even paused to wonder what they required to recover. No one wondered about the pain of living in a body that would always bear the scars of trauma. But this is not just a tale of suffering, it is one of strength, of women who, despite every attempt to erase them, shielded one another, survived unbearable circumstances, and resisted in the most quiet and bravest terms, by living. When we tell these stories, we're not merely filling in holes in history, we're making the silenced speak. We're celebrating a kind of strength that history doesn't often note, the strength of women who lived through the unlivable and somehow managed to keep themselves and each other intact. Let us never forget, even at their worst, most inhumane, women managed to find a way to be human.